For years, no one could fully explain what really happened around the death of Andy Griffith. The world remembers him as one of the most beloved faces in American television history, a man who brought warmth, humor, and moral calm into millions of homes through The Andy Griffith Show. But on the morning of July 3, 2012, that image of comfort was shattered in a way that left more questions than answers. Andy Griffith passed away quietly, and within just 4 hours and 53 minutes, he was already buried. No public funeral, no press gathering, no televised farewell, no final goodbye from the world that had adored him for decades. And by the time most of America even learned of his death, it was already too late. The burial had been completed. The story was already closed. The speed of it shocked everyone. The press called it suspicious. Fans called it heartbreaking, and even disrespectful. People struggled to understand how a man who had been such a massive cultural figure could disappear so quietly, almost erased from public view in a matter of hours. But the truth behind those 5 hours was not about conspiracy or scandal. It was about something far more personal, far more emotional, and far more human. It was about a man who spent nearly 50 years giving the world a carefully shaped version of himself, warm, gentle, always in control, while quietly protecting the parts of himself that the public was never meant to see. To understand this final decision, we have to go back to where it all began. Andy Samuel Griffith was born on June 1, 1926, in Mount Airy, North Carolina, a small town nestled in the Blue Ridge foothills. It was not a place of luxury or opportunity. It was a place of struggle, shaped by the harsh realities of the Depression era. His family lived with financial hardship, often without basic comforts like running water, and every day carried the quiet weight of uncertainty. Yet, within that simple and difficult life, something extraordinary was forming inside young Andy Griffith. Even as a child, his voice stood out. It wasn't just sound, it was presence. In church, when he sang, people listened differently. There was a natural calmness in his tone, a warmth that seemed far too large for his age. He didn't perform like a child trying to be heard. He sounded like someone who already understood the power of being heard. That voice would later become one of the most recognizable in American entertainment history, but at the time, it was just a small light in a quiet town. At school, Andy was never the most athletic or academically outstanding student, but he was noticed for something else entirely: his ability to hold attention. On stage, during school plays and performances, something changed in him. Teachers saw it clearly. One teacher in particular, Ed Mickey, recognized that Andy was not just participating in drama, he was becoming it. That early encouragement planted a seed that would eventually grow into a national career. That path eventually led him to the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, where he studied music and performance. For the first time in his life, he was surrounded by people from entirely different worlds, people with money, privilege, and connections. But instead of being intimidated, Andy observed. He learned. And he realized something important that would shape his entire future. Talent could come from anywhere, but survival in the entertainment world required something deeper than talent alone. After college, he briefly worked as a teacher, but the stage kept pulling him back. He began performing comedic monologues, storytelling pieces filled with Southern humor and observational comedy. One of his earliest successes, a routine called What It Was Football, became a massive hit, selling hundreds of thousands of copies and turning him into a rising name almost overnight. It was the beginning of something much larger than anyone could have predicted. Hollywood soon came calling, but Andy Griffith's early film career revealed something unexpected. In A Face in the Crowd, he delivered a chilling performance as a manipulative and dangerous character, completely opposite to the warm, innocent persona audiences would later associate with him. Critics were stunned by his range. He was not just a comedian or a gentle storyteller. He was capable of darkness, depth, and complexity that most actors never reached. But Hollywood did not know how to use that version of him. The industry wanted simplicity. It wanted warmth. It wanted a man the audience could trust without question. And so, When the opportunity came in 1960 to play a small-town sheriff in a new television series called The Andy Griffith Show, he accepted a role that would define the rest of his life. What followed was cultural history. The show became one of the most beloved television series in America. Sheriff Andy Taylor was everything the nation wanted to believe about itself: calm, fair, wise, and deeply human. In a time of political tension, social change, and national uncertainty, Mayberry became a fictional refuge. It was a place where problems were solved with patience instead of violence, and where kindness always had the final word. But behind the success, something slowly began to shift inside Andy Griffith himself. The more America loved Sheriff Andy Taylor, the more difficult it became for him to separate the character from the man. People didn't just watch him on television, they saw him as that character in real life. They called him Sheriff in public. They expected the same warmth, the same patience, the same moral certainty. And over time, that expectation became a burden he could not easily escape. Those closest to him described a man living with contradiction. He could be incredibly kind and generous, but also deeply restless and private. Fame had given him everything the world could offer, but it had also taken away something he valued even more: the ability to simply exist without being observed. His personal life suffered under that weight. Marriages ended. Relationships strained. The line between Andy Griffith the person and Andy Taylor the symbol grew thinner every year. By the time he left the Andy Griffith Show in 1968, he was already emotionally exhausted. He stepped away from success at its peak, something few entertainers ever do. But what followed was not freedom. It was silence. The industry struggled to place him. The public struggled to accept him in anything other than his most famous role. And for years, he moved through projects that never quite matched the impact of what he had left behind. Then came Matlock in the 1980s, a second major success that reintroduced him to a new generation. But even this return carried a sense of control rather than joy. It was calculated, careful, and shaped by experience. He was no longer the wide-eyed performer from Mount Airy. He was a man who understood exactly what fame could take away. Behind all of this, his health also began to decline. A serious neurological illness left him temporarily paralyzed, forcing him to confront something he had spent his entire life avoiding: his own mortality. For a man whose identity was built on presence, voice, and control, the experience was deeply unsettling. It changed him. It made him more private, more intentional, and far more aware of how fragile life truly was. In his later years, Andy Griffith made a decision that would define his final legacy. He did not want his death to become a public event. He did not want cameras, headlines, or global commentary. He had watched too many public figures turn their final moments into media spectacles, and he refused to let his own life end that way. So when he passed away on July 3, 2012, his family followed his exact wishes. Everything was done privately, quietly, and with extraordinary speed. Within less than 5 hours, he was buried on private land at his home on Roanoke Island. No announcements had been made beforehand. No media presence was allowed. By the time the world learned what had happened, it was already over. The reaction was immediate and divided. Some fans felt hurt, as if they had been denied the chance to say goodbye. Others understood it as the final act of a man who had spent his entire life balancing public love with private identity. Because in the end, Andy Griffith was never just Sheriff Andy Taylor. That was the role the world loved. But the man himself had always existed somewhere beyond it, quiet, complex, and deeply protective of his own privacy. And perhaps that is the final truth of those 5 hours. Not mystery, not scandal, but choice. It's made by a man who gave the world everything it asked for, and in the end, asked for just one thing in return: to be left alone. As the news of Andy Griffith's death slowly began to spread across America, it didn't arrive in the way most celebrity deaths usually do. There were no live breaking news alerts at first, no emotional press conferences, no immediate public tributes. Instead, there was silence, followed by confusion, and then shock. Because by the time the world even began processing that he was gone, something even more unbelievable had already happened. He had already been buried. Quietly. Privately. Almost invisibly. This detail alone turned his passing into one of the most debated and emotionally charged moments in television history. For decades, Andy Griffith had been more than just an actor. He had become a symbol of comfort, stability, and moral clarity in American culture. Through the Andy Griffith Show, he had built a fictional world called Mayberry that felt more real to people than many places they had actually lived in. It was a world where kindness always mattered, where justice was simple, and where humanity still felt gentle. And because of that, fans didn't just watch him, they emotionally belonged to him. So when they discovered that he had been buried in less than 5 hours, without any public ceremony, many felt something deeper than sadness. They felt excluded. They felt as if a shared chapter of their lives had been closed without permission. The question spread quickly across newspapers, television discussions, and early internet forums. Why would a man so loved be sent away in such silence? But those who looked deeper into Andy Griffith's life understood something very different. This was not a sudden decision made in grief or confusion. This was the final expression of a philosophy he had carried for decades. Because Andy Griffith had always understood fame in a way very few people ever do. He had lived through its beauty, but he had also lived through its cost. Behind the image of Sheriff Andy Taylor, there had always been a man who struggled with the weight of being permanently seen. Every public appearance, every interview, every fan interaction carried the same expectation: to remain the gentle, wise, endlessly patient figure people had grown up with. Over time, that expectation stopped being a role and started becoming a cage. He was no longer just performing a character, he was being measured against it in real life. As the years passed, Andy began to withdraw emotionally from the version of himself the world demanded. He had seen what fame did to people when they lost control of their own narrative. He had seen how public figures, even in death, were turned into media events, their final moments replayed, analyzed, and consumed. And he hated that idea more than anything. To him, death was not content. It was not performance. It was not a public property. That belief became even stronger after his health began to fail. His battle with Guillain-Barré syndrome left him physically weakened and emotionally reflective. For the first time, he was forced to confront the reality that the same body that once carried him through stages, cameras, and decades of performance was no longer fully under his control. It was during this time that his desire for privacy stopped being a preference and became a final, firm decision. He told his wife and close family clearly that when his time came, he did not want spectacle. He did not want ceremonies designed for television. He did not want crowds of strangers turning grief into performance. He wanted peace. He wanted silence. And most importantly, he wanted control over the final chapter of a life that had already been publicly owned for too long. So when that final morning arrived on Roanoke Island, everything unfolded exactly as he had planned. There was no chaos, no confusion, no hesitation. Only calm. Only respect. Only quiet execution of a wish that had been carefully thought through long before the moment actually came. And within hours, the world had lost him without witnessing the moment of loss itself. The reaction, when it finally came, revealed something powerful about the relationship between celebrities and the public. Many fans struggled to accept the absence of closure. They were used to goodbyes being shared, broadcasted, and collectively experienced. But Andy Griffith's departure broke that pattern completely. It removed the audience from the final scene. And in doing so, it forced a difficult realization. Not every life, no matter how famous, belongs entirely to the public. In the days that followed, reflections from those who had worked with him added even more depth to the story. Co-stars like Ron Howard spoke with quiet understanding rather than criticism. They described him as a man who had always done things in his own way, even when the world expected otherwise. Don Knotts, had he been alive at the time, would have likely understood it too. Because those who knew Andy Griffith personally knew that beneath the gentle television image was a deeply independent and private individual who valued dignity above attention. Over time, the shock of the rapid burial slowly transformed into something else. Perspective. People began to revisit his life not just as a television legend, but as a human being who had spent decades balancing two identities, the one the world loved and the one he lived privately. And the more they understood that divide, the more his final decisions started to make sense. Because in the end, Andy Griffith's story was never just about fame. It was about ownership. Who owns a public figure? The audience that loves them? The industry that builds them? Or the person themselves? Who lives behind the image? Andy Griffith answered that question not with words, but with action. His final hours were not about secrecy. They were about control. Not control over others, but control over self. A final assertion that even after a lifetime of being watched, judged, and remembered, there was still one moment that belonged only to him and his closest family. And perhaps that is why his story continues to resonate so strongly even today. Because beyond the fame, beyond Mayberry, beyond Sheriff Andy Taylor, there was a man who quietly made one final decision that challenged how the world understands celebrity itself. He didn't leave with applause. He didn't leave with cameras. He didn't leave with spectacle. He left exactly how he chose to leave. In silence, in dignity, and in peace.